Hello, and welcome to the February 27th edition of the SIG Cluster Lifecycle Cluster API breakout meeting. See, Hardik, you've got the first action item on the agenda today.
Yes. So, hi, everyone. As discussed in the last meeting, I reached out to Mashia from Cluster Autoscaler community, and we figured that maybe it's a good idea to get together sometime, and I think we can meet tomorrow. So basically Thursday on 28th February, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. CET time zone. And yeah, so I have, so Robert helped me in creating the Zoom URL. And if any of you guys are interested in joining the meeting, you could probably add it to your calendar already. And most probably what we will expect is that we have a couple of questions open with respect to cluster autoscaler and machine controller integration, mainly the scale down strategy PR that we have been discussing. We'll try to settle on that first of all, and that will be more or less the agenda for the meeting. And we'll see if we require more such meetings in future, then we may go ahead with such setup. But for now, tomorrow is what we plan to do. Yeah, so just wanted to update everyone on this.
There were also some questions, I think, in Slack last week about whether there was an overall tracking issue for the integration work between the cluster API and the autoscaler. And I think the Slack conversation and I both determined that there was not a tracking issue. There are a couple of issues for specific integration points, right? In particular, the scaling down by a specific machine, but there wasn't an overall tracking issue. And I think one thing we should do here is we should create an overall tracking issue, and then we can see for people who sort of subscribe themselves to that issue, we can make sure that they're aware of meetings like this that are coming up. And also, people who've opened PRs, are likely to be interested, and we can ping them and let them know that we'll use sort of a single tracking issue as the coordination point for this work.
Yes, I think that makes perfect sense. So I can probably take up that thing. I can probably create one issue which probably connects the smaller fragmented issues and PRs and gives more or less a larger picture that what are the things required to integrate the autoscaler inside the machine controller. And yeah, we can track such meetings and minutes there as well. I mean, makes sense to me.
All right, Vince and Hui have a PSA next.
Yeah, Hui worked on the integration test. I put it on a hold on it. Just a little PSA that this is going to be required after we merge it. So if you have any problems, please feel free to reach out. And thanks, Hui, for working on this.
Yay to more testing. What does the integration test do today?
Yeah, I can provide some feedback context here. So we add a mockup provider, example provider there. And what the integration test has done today is just to compile the two managers and create a client cluster and deploy their CLDs to the client cluster. And we actually want to add more verifications like the CLDs, and also in the mockup provider, we generate events for every call, and we want to verify those events a little bit later. But I just feel like it can provide some value now if we enable it, and it can catch the obvious issue. We can add more verifications a little bit later.
Sounds great. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions on that one? All right. Next, David has an update on documentation issues.
Hi. So I've been adding some notes to the notes, but they're actually in the wrong order. So first, I wanted to let everyone know what the status of the update process is. Ben the Elder has been working with Kate's Infra to determine what a proper URL naming scheme will be. And once that's determined, we believe we're going to share the same Netlify accounts to serve our Git documentation. So that's where we are on that. Now, there's an umbrella issue for documentation requirements, and there's at least 2, maybe 3 or 4 actually, issues or PRs open now for documentation that needs to be fixed. And I'd like to start working on those, but there are 2 big items that are not really documented now, and I just wanted to get a feel from the group in terms of whether or not anyone was interested in documenting them, whether we thought they were necessary to document for V1 Alpha 1, etc. And so those 2 issues are, right now, the machine set, machine deployment, machine class. Those are generic controllers, but there's no real machine set anyway, and there's no real documentation around that. There's just the API. So the question is anyone using that controller, and would anyone like to document it? Okay. All right. So I guess we'll just revisit this towards the end. I personally think it's fine if we were to ship V1 Alpha 1 and we were just confident about the machine API, and the machine set API wasn't necessarily fully documented or complete. That's just my opinion.
I can, if no one else will step up, I will write you want someone to write up the docs for the machine set controller? Is that right?
Yeah.
I can,
yeah.
Was there some, yes? I mean, I can do that if no one else is eager to do so. Was there another thing that you want documented or not? I'm sorry.
Cluster control is the other thing that is not documented.
Yeah, that one I don't have a lot of to.
Exactly what kind of documentation that we're talking about?
Right. So how to use the implementation. So right now, the cluster controller, there's shared cluster deployer code in the common repo, and you have to build provider specific binaries, and that development process isn't documented.
Okay, as I have been doing that myself for learning, I can join that effort if you like. I have recently been trying to do that exactly, and I can try to document what I'm doing. But I don't know if much more. I mean, beyond what is in book. In the book is more or less like just say follow this step. But do you want to document like implementing a real controller based on this? I mean, we can talk offline if you like. I mean, or later, just to understand the scope.
Maybe I should open a ticket and we can talk about it in the issue, so everyone can participate. Thank you.
Is this part of like V1 Alpha 1 to get some of this documentation in place? Because there's broader documentation problems that kind of currently exist. Is this a subset of that, David?
So this ticket is in the V1 Alpha 1 milestone, and it's an umbrella issue. It has a number of things, and you're right that updating the documentation now doesn't actually change the live documentation. There's a manual deployment process. So we have a larger documentation issue. And I think this is one of the things that we could kick out of V1 Alpha 1. And that was sort of the question is, to what extent do we want V1 Alpha 1 to be documented?
I would, given the federation of the providers, I think that's super important to have good, clean documentation. I think one thing we learned from KK as a lesson of what not to do is to have bad documentation on the releases, because the fallout from that flows back into the project in multiple different incantations. People don't know where to file issues. They don't know what's going on with like how to get the release artifacts. So we've never done, until we actually threw down in something like kubeadm, we actually devoted people towards executing on the docs as part of the deliverable for a given milestone. We suffered from this, and it backfired on us for a long time. So as a lesson learned, I think it's probably pretty important to resource this appropriately to try and get this as part of the deliveries, or part of the deliverables for V1 Alpha 1.
I agree. So I'll go ahead and open an issue for cluster control and machine set documentation. So actually, I'll open a sub issue for every issue in the umbrella in case that makes it easier for others to pick up parts of it. And then again, I think all of the current open documentation tickets are things that either I've been assigned and have done or plan to do, and we're just waiting for the Netify account so that we can actually submit a PR and update it.
All right, should we move on to the alpha burndown list? Excellent. I don't know who's been driving this for the last couple weeks. I've been out sick. It says 24 open issues, and I am scrolling down to see where we were at last week. Maybe we didn't do this last week. Come on. Maybe 2 weeks ago. No, 3 weeks ago. All right. I guess we haven't done this for a while. I was trying to see if we
could... actually went up.
What do you say?
The number actually went up by 3. So.
Okay, I was trying to find the last time we did this to see if which way the number was trending. Okay, so the numbers, Vince says the number's up. I know that there are at least some of the issues that are in there that are linked to PRs that I have not gotten to reviewing because I've been not in the office much, so I've been feeling awfully sick, as has the rest of my family. Do you know, Vince, offhand, which PRs got added? And we can talk about those real quick.
I think those are like the documentation related ones. So it goes back to the to David's point. There was set owner ref, which is new, which I'm actually currently working on. And cluster cutter should use alpha phases. That's also those are 2 plus the docs.
Okay, so the new ones look like they all have assignees. I'm also scrolling through the list, and it looks like 1, 2, there are like 5 of them that don't have assignees to them yet.
Yep.
2 of which are more recent. Maybe we can talk about those briefly. So one is 746, which is adding support for adopting existing machine sets to machine deployments, which looks like Jason opened 2 weeks ago.
Yep, so I added this because there's a to-do comment in the machine deployment controller today saying basically implement machine set adoption. So we weren't tracking it anywhere outside of that to-do comment.
Okay, and so the idea would be if somebody manually changes labels, that the machine deployment would pick up a machine set.
Well, so it's more during like the pivot process right now. So once a machine deployment is pivoted, the owner ref is no longer there. So the machine deployment doesn't, reconnect with the machine sets post pivot.
Okay, so right now we can't pivot machine deployments, then it sounds like.
Yeah, so the pivot PR that I have open right now, I work around it by basically recreating the correct owner reference after migrating the machine sets over. So we can work around it, but ideally we would be able to, use the same logic that we currently have with the machine sets, to where it'll automatically readopt the machines that are associated with the by the label selector.
All right. Does anybody on the call want to sign up to implement that?
Okay,
All right. Thanks, Ed.
I'll do it. I'm already working on this code, so.
Cool. All right. I assign the issue to you. The other new one that doesn't have an assignee is creating a mock provider for testing core controllers.
I kind of consider this already be done by my PR.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. It sounds like this is sort of overlapping with your PR.
Right. So I think, yeah, if Pablo agree, I think we can mark this be done.
Yeah, definitely your approach is much better. I mean, it's cleaner.
Cool. Why don't we mark your PR as fixing this issue then? Or did it already merge, or is it still outstanding? I haven't looked.
The PR already merged.
Okay, excellent. Let's go ahead and close this referencing your PR then. Can you take that action?
I'll do that. Thanks.
Thanks. All right, then we can adjust the numbers. So now we're down to only 23 open issues. Boom.
So the comment below is the long-term issues can be bumped if needed. Given the fact that we are T-minus 1 month away from our sort of hand-wavy date, should we bump them? I mean, this is typical modus operandi. Is the code freeze for KubeADM is for 114 is next week. Anything inside of the backlog we would bump at this stage.
Let me look at what those 4 issues are. I'm doing that now.
I believe there is only one long-term left. I got one assigned, and the other one we just closed it.
So one of them, the machine set support for defining specific machines, that one already has an outstanding PR.
Okay.
So that one's issue number 75.
Yeah, the ones I see labeled long-term are 75, the one that we just assigned to Vince for adoption during pivoting, cluster cuddle using alpha phases, which is also assigned to Vince. And I thought there was one more. Yeah, and then 75 that Jason was mentioning. So there are 3 because one of them just got closed. So I guess for the 2 ones in the 700 range that are assigned to Vince, we can ask Vince if he thinks those will get in time. And then 75, I had tried to assign to Messam because he was going to work on that, but he is still not quite a member of the Kubernetes SIGs org, even though he's a member of the Kubernetes org. So the assignee was failing. I don't think he's on the call today to provide any sort of status updates, but it's related to the meeting that's going to happen tomorrow. And maybe after that meeting, it'll become clear whether or not we can implement that in time.
So for me, the 746 adoption is it's like a pretty quick fix from what I can tell. The other one, it's reliant upon Jason's work. So I'll defer you to Jason on that one. And we can always punt it if like phases, it's like late, right? It's fine.
I think it's probably safe to go ahead and punt that one out to next at this point.
Done.
What about 204? Add a cap for number of concurrent deletion calls in machine set controller. It's been open for a while, and I would argue it's not strictly necessary for an alpha release.
I won't argue about bumping that one.
Same. It's probably fine.
Yeah, that one's currently assigned to you, Jason. Do you want to unassign and bump it out?
Yep.
And the priorities could probably be changed to long term as well. There's only one critical that I see, which is the versioning and support. Have other people had a chance to review and talk about the documents that are there? Because, you know, we need to release something.
I've started re-looking at them today, but still catching up, paging that in.
Yeah, let me get a link to the 2 documents. I think last week I only shared one of the 2 documents. The other one is related to release process for Cluster API and all the providers. So let me put that in the notes.
Do we have, Robbie, for this cycle, are we planning to just do manual sort of release?
As far as I know, yes. I don't think anybody has proposed or started building any sort of release automation.
Are there any other issues folks want to bump out of this cycle?
$253 maybe? I'll link it. Update cluster cuddle when machines objects have a provisioning indication. I think, David, you commented on this like a few months ago.
Yeah, I think it would be fine to depend on the annotation.
But is the question like, do we need this for V1 Alpha 1?
Okay, so yeah, so all this is to have a replacement instead of using an annotation. So cluster control right now waits for an annotation or a node ref to determine when a machine has been provisioned, and I think it's fine to depend on the annotation right now. There's another issue for the node ref problem, and I would like to discuss that too, but I think I would like to discuss it next week, unless someone else is prepared to talk to it today.
David, are you talking about the API access?
Yeah, it's related to that.
Yeah, so we were talking about this yesterday at the office hours, and I think we realized that there are some actions that the cluster API control plane or some operations that the cluster API control plane will be making that against the API of the cluster that is managing the lifecycle of, and if the management cluster is running in a different environment from the managed cluster, if the cluster API control plane is running in a separate cluster, then what is the mechanism by which it has access to the managed cluster's API. So for example, here the operation would be to list the nodes and to understand which node is associated with which machine. So it's just I guess a problem that we haven't maybe discussed before.
Okay. So since we have some time, why don't we go ahead and discuss this just to close off the previous issue. So for 253, I've added a comment saying that I propose we leave this as is. What this means is that the documentation currently says that you should annotate, actually, I'll need to check this to make sure that it says that you must annotate in order for cluster control to work. And that's the status quo, so nothing will have changed. It's just a question of, do we want to eventually remove that annotation and have some alternative mechanism to determine when a node has been provisioned. So before we move on to the node ref problem, does anyone have an opinion on whether or not it's important to remove the requirement for cluster control to see an annotation to determine when a node is provisioned? Okay. So I propose we go ahead and push that into next. I'll leave that to Sam or Robert.
I can bump it.
Okay. So excellent. Now moving on. So the issue that we're talking about is okay, so it's 5:20. I want to pull it up and manage the notes. The basic problem is that when you have a manager and a managed cluster, the cluster API resources exist in the manager cluster, but the node resources exist in the managed cluster. And what this means is that the node ref field in the cluster API resources will not be set. And this means that the machine set controller cannot, for instance, check the node conditions to determine node health. So the basic problem here is that the manager operators or controllers need to be able to access the API server in the managed cluster. And in order to do that, they need credentials. We don't have, cluster API does not store secrets. And so it's a provider implementation detail. And so one proposal I've been thinking about is perhaps the node controller needs an actuator so that it can create the links and copy the conditions between the objects in the managed cluster and the objects in the manager cluster. But all of the solutions that I see to this problem are fairly invasive. which is why I kind of wanted to talk about it next week, because when I think about the solution of having an actuator, given that we only have 1 month, my inclination is to say that this should be punted to the next milestone. So does anyone not understand the problem?
Do you anticipate that there would ever be a time where the manager cluster would not have access to the API server of the managed cluster?
Yes.
So a solution to this particular issue would need to, presumably need to include some mechanism that doesn't involve that direct communication, right?
So if we're going to manage a lifecycle beyond just install, we'd have to have some method of communication either into the cluster directly via the API, or we would need, like some of the providers are doing, some type of persistent access to be able to run remote commands on individual instances that are part of that cluster. I don't think we can actually manage more than just install if we don't have some type of persistent access to the cluster.
So in the case when you have a cloud provider, I could imagine you using the cloud provider's health checks and using the cloud providers, for instance, in Amazon, you could allocate and deallocate EC2 instances without access to the API server. I'm not saying it's a good way to do it.
Right, but that doesn't give you access into the health of the cluster itself. That only gives you access into the health of the machine instance. You have a VM and the VM is up, but you don't actually know that that VM is an active, functioning, healthy node within that cluster.
Right. So I think you're arguing that the manager cluster must have access to the API server of the managed cluster because we're making the assumption that the node health is determined by the node resource in the managed cluster. Maybe that's more than you're saying, but.
I would like to make that a requirement because it would simplify how we handle those types of scenarios versus having to have some other type of back channel to be able to access that information.
I agree.
Which is a little bit what we do in the AWS provider today. We generate the certificate so we have access to the cluster. We generate the kubeconfig and then set the node ref. And it works in a management scenario because we do have access.
I don't know, but you know much better the overall architecture, but something that's really fits to me that we force this refers to a different abstraction we should know just to check the health, because the responsibility of the machine controller, for instance, provide machines. Something there is not, I understand the problem, but at the same time, it's like just bringing some abstraction just to do some checking, because you don't want only to check the machine, but also that the machine is actually providing a service for the cluster, which is a node. But I don't know why, for me, it's like bringing a huge, abstraction and all the ability of having been able to access that abstraction, the node, just for ensuring the health check. And it's something with the responsibility of the different component that probably doesn't really match to me. I don't really, I guess it's just something I don't can really understand now if that's really what we want to do. I understand the problem. The problem is real. But I don't know if this is the best way.
So I have a question, Vince, in terms of how AWS does this. You said that you set the node rep and then you're able to act, and then that works in the management cluster case. So you guys support machine set controllers yet?
Do we? I don't know. I mean, like, I think like Chuck tried it.
So the machine set controllers generally work, but we don't, like, if you're running on a management cluster, you don't have the node health check status available. I mean,
So okay, so you actually you do have this problem in terms of supporting machine sets, and I think the fix to it. So the reason. So let's assume that we need API access. Let's assume that we're going to use the node rep resource as a surrogate for node health, and that requires API access, and that requires authentication. And so, if you believe that chain of thought, then the question is, who's responsible for managing authentication? And since, like, the obvious answer would be you would store the config as a secret in the namespace, I think that a lot of people would argue that's not secure, and people have gone to great lengths to avoid doing that. So, so unless we could really reach consensus on a secure way to store the secrets, I think it seems likely we have to make this a provider-specific implementation detail, which suggests that you need to have an actuator or some other extension mechanism in order to implement it. So that's where we got at the end of yesterday, the provider implementation meeting.
Got it. Okay. I think I need to go and test this out in AWS after this call.
I mean, one additional thing that kind of comes to mind is, wouldn't the API server access to the target cluster needed, for example, more than just the health check that we're talking about right now? For example, upgrade, or anything wherein this orchestrator, which is the controller that is running on the manager side, has to do something or interact with the target cluster to do some operation, whether it is triggering, maybe an update of the kubectl or kubelet or anything of that sort, even the add-ons for that matter.
I think the distinction is specifically for if we're thinking about something like invoking kubeadm, that may not require direct access to the, or that may not require exposing the API over the network. You may be able to use some other mechanism, right? SSH, and then maybe you could have a tunnel to the API via your SSH connection. But yeah, and then another example might be garbage collection of machines that are or machines that have been decommissioned or maybe have failed. The corresponding node will not be cleaned up if there's not an infrastructure API. If there's an infrastructure API, then the cloud controller manager will clean up those node objects. But if there isn't, then it's up to the management cluster to clean up those objects.
So I don't think it's too onerous to add that if you're going to provision clusters with cluster API, that you have some type of external cloud provider to provide that cleanup service either. So.
How would that work if there's not an infrastructure API?
Well, so somehow you're interacting to give a machine for use. So, I mean, you should be able to leverage a similar mechanism for how you're determining, what machine to actually operate against to build a custom external cloud provider using the interfaces to provide a cleanup for the node when it's decommissioned.
I mean, okay, that's a different way to solve that problem, but it seems, you know, like building a custom cloud provider implementation seems more complex than saying that, you know, the management cluster will clean up node
The
objects.
one thing that I have is one of the things that we're looking at recently is how can we scope down permissions, both for the external cloud providers we're doing, but also RBAC-wise as well. And it would seem odd to me that we would give power to necessarily update and delete node objects from the machine controller.
Why? I mean, if the management cluster is able to, you know, if it manages the life cycle of the cluster, why is it that having access to the node objects the drawback?
I mean, maybe it's not. It's just if there's another mechanism that already exists, it almost seems like we'd be recreating the wheel here.
Yeah. That's already been my point. I mean, even what looks like more complicated, a custom cloud provider for that is cleaner because abstraction is that. I mean, its responsibility fits better. You're not bringing one abstraction from one layer to another just to be able to check something that makes sense, but it's probably not in that way. The other ways looks like more complex, but if we provide some basic implementation just to fulfill that specific use case, is for, I think it's cleaner. It's just, it fits better in my understanding of the different pieces as responsibility. I would expect that to be the responsibility to be there, not in the cluster API side.
I have also little bit. I'm also in a little bit of the confusion, but I'm still trying to understand that what if we have a management cluster concept, then the management cluster becomes the most important cluster, right? It already knows a lot of things. For example, if we are going to host the cluster API controllers and machine API controllers in there, simply the fact that it would already have the cloud provider specific secrets and so on, which will help it create the real machines and stuff. And that is the baseline secret that anyone would want to keep, right? I mean, if you have the cloud provider specific secret, then you can do more or less whatever you want to do. And just wondering that in the current architecture, though, if I understand correctly, the machine API controllers, which are more or less only machine set, machine deployment, only part of the machine controller, and we have a completely independent machine controller, right? So from the kubeconfig access point of view, we could at max go in a direction where these independent machine controller anyway requires access to both of the kubeconfigs of the call it the target cluster and the managed and the control cluster. But you can probably think of a way where these other shared controllers might have restricted access because it may not require access to the target cluster. Which why? Because this other shared controllers only requires to need to read the machine object, which is already filled by the machine controller, which is independent and which knows more or less about both of the clusters. Now it's up to us to decide who is hosted well. If we decide to host machine controller completely inside the managed cluster and then say that, okay, I am not keeping the kubeconfig related secrets in my management cluster, then it might be okay from the architecture point of view. But the baseline question still remains that if we have a management cluster and if we plan to store the secrets like cloud provider specific secret, if my AWS access key and AWS access key ID kind of stuff is there, then it's anyway a big thing for me to lose if I lose the management cluster's access. So just trying to think that we can probably solve from 2-3 problems, we can probably solve one problem, but the other problems will still remain in this area, right? Or maybe I have got some parts wrong and
From a recommended best practices, though, like we should try to steer clear of potential single point of failure to pwn multiple clusters where possible. If we store things as secrets, that's a potentially dangerous scenario that we could allow for that type of, having an external client that is much more secure, whatever it may be, that isn't co-located with that information is probably recommended. We've batted around this topic several times.
So as an action item, I think I'm going to write up, I'll listen to this conversation again and try to write up a summary in the ticket so that we can think about it offline. I think it's kind of difficult without preparation because there's a number of overlapping issues. So maybe we can, we don't have to stop talking about it now, but maybe we could also revisit it once I've summarized it.
All right, so we have a couple minutes left, about 8, if I'm reading the clock correctly. Does anybody else have anything that they'd like to mention before the end of the call? I was just going through my open PRs and trying to add comments to those, so hopefully I'm not blocking so many people anymore. There are quite a few open PRs in the backlog. I think I saw like 17. So if those are assigned to you, please do take a few minutes to go through and review those, because I think we'd like to keep the backlog pretty small. Also, if you have PRs that you're no longer going to be working on, or if it looks like one's assigned to you that somebody's not actually doing anymore, please ping it and or close it so that we, again, try to keep the backlog pretty small. All right, is there anything else folks would like to discuss? All right, well, it sounds like we'll wrap up a couple minutes early today. Thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you all again next week. Take care.
Bye. Take care.